Good evening, everyone. My name is Amy Skillman, and I am director of the MA in Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. I want to welcome you all to the third webinar in our fall 2024 Chat Fest series of conversations about community organizing and social justice through the use of stories. And before we begin, I want to just go over a couple of quick reminders. Closed captioning is available if you like by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we will be recording this. So if you prefer not to be on screen, just simply turn off your video. That's fine. Keep your microphone on mute right now if you can. And your setting on speaker view so that you can get the full effect of speaking of our speakers. But then you'll be able to switch that to gallery mode and turn on your microphone when we open it up for conversation with the audience. If a question does come up for you while any of us are speaking, go ahead and put it in the chat. And then either Taylor Seitzinger, who's here, or I will keep our eyes out for it and monitor the chat and make sure your question gets included. Now, we do call this Chat Fest because our series they're all designed as conversations. We'll begin with some opening remarks by Robert Barron and Caron Atlas, and then we'll open it up for a kind of moderated dialogue or a chat. So in the meantime, please feel free to communicate with each other using the chat function. And if you like, you can go ahead and begin and just say something about who you are and why you're here. If you'd like to do that, that would be great. So, as I said, this is the third session in our Fall Chat Fest series of online conversations. And this semester, we've been exploring storytelling and oral history as valued strategies for our graduate program here. Our MA in Cultural Sustainability, storytelling as a methodology and the use of oral history is very much a part of what we teach and strategies that we use in our community-based research work. Our next session, and it'll be the last one for this year, will be on November 20th at 6 p.m. And we will be exploring the question, why cultural sustainability? So if you want, you can join us then to learn more details about our graduate program, which is which is a limited residency program. So students come to campus once or twice a year for an intensive residency and then do the rest of the courses online. So we'll tell you more about that. You'll be able to meet some of our alumni, some of the students in the program, ask some questions, and get some answers. So I mentioned Taylor Seitzinger, but I want to introduce her. She is our graduate student admissions counselor, and both her email address and my email address will be in the last slide at the end of our session. So if you missed any of the previous online conversations, you can access recordings on our YouTube channel, which amazingly enough is called Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. Taylor's going to put the link in there in case you want to click on it and follow, but you can listen in on some of our past recordings. And you can see we have our image of Kiran Singh, Kiran Singh Sirah, who is here with us tonight as well. So Taylor will also we do have a couple more, I think beyond our session on November 20th, a couple of the other graduate programs have information sessions. But if you go there and sign up and get registered for any of the other ones, then you'll also be on our list to get announcements about next spring's sessions once we figure out what those are. And then finally, I'll ask Taylor to put the link into the homepage for the MA in Cultural Sustainability, in case any of you are interested in learning more about that graduate program, our graduate program. So onto the program. Social change is often catalyzed by community activism that incorporates arts and culture into the process. And so in this conversation tonight, cultural activist, writer, and educator Caron Atlas will share stories about supporting imagination in neighborhoods in order to enact change. She'll talk about creative placekeeping from the community up, which builds on local assets and furthers equity in those communities. Well, in communities broadly. We'll also explore how grassroots action can help shape public policy. Caron is director of Arts and Democracy, which cross-fertilizes arts and culture, civic participation, and community change. She also directs Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts, New York. I love this concept. Can't wait to hear more about it. It's a citywide alliance revitalizing New York City from the neighborhood up. NOCD New York was a primary partner in New York City's first cultural plan called Create NYC. Caron teaches at New York University and the Pratt Institute. Previously, Caron worked at Appalshop, the Appalachian Cultural Center, and directed the American Festival Project, a national coalition of activist artists. She has consulted with Animating Democracy, the Pratt Center for Community Development, the Network for Ensemble Theaters, the Urban Institute, and several foundations. Her publications include, and some of you may have read these, especially if you're students in our classes. She's co-editor of Bridge Conversations and Critical Perspectives, Writings on Art and Civic Dialogue, and a contributor to Toward a 21st Century City for All. She was a Rockefeller Foundation Warren Weaver Fellow and is a Coro Leadership New York alumnus. She received her BA and her MA from the University of Chicago. So moderating our webinar today is Robert Barron. He's retired director of the Folk Arts Program and the Music Program at the New York State Council on the Arts. He's president for 2024 of the Intangible Cultural Heritage NGO Forum, which advises UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, and travels all over the world exploring intangible cultural heritage. And he's a faculty member in our program, the MA in Cultural Sustainability, where he's currently teaching our course on cultural policy. So, oh, I forgot to switch to this slide while I was talking about Caron. Bummer. Okay, so we'll not go to that slide just yet. And I'll turn it over to Robert. And welcome Caron, and welcome Robert.
Thank you, Amy. We're thrilled to have Caron here. And to say a few more things about Caron, she's an out-of-the-box thinker about community arts and community, and really brings together theory and practice. We know in our classes about her approach to cultural democracy, which is a totalizing approach, which looks at arts and creativity throughout humankind, that everybody has a right to creative expression, and that the right should be respected and exercised, and through whatever means possible to make it happen. And I think her work has really been a departure from much of the conventional activity in community arts. So it's quite important in that sense. She's a driving force between several organizations. I think that some of them are the same, Caron: Animating Democracy, Arts and Democracy, and Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts is another organization, which I think you'll hear about, looking at culture as a catalyst for community organization and revitalization. And another significance about Caron's work, another thing that's significant, is she's really developed an alternative to creative placemaking, which often brings resources from outside of a community and plants them in a community, and is often a first wave of a second wave of gentrification. And I know, Karen, you call creative placekeeping rather than creative placemaking. I'm interested in why you have the change in name. It's intriguing. And Karen and her colleagues who she's worked with, her partners, have developed strategies to bridging different kinds of people in community, different types of stakeholders, people with different perspectives, bridging these divisions or respecting their individual perspectives to as a motor, as a means for community development. And I don't want to embarrass you further, Karen, but I'll just add that she's my closest by colleague who run into in the street. She's a member of my food co-op. And our neighborhood is a poster child for gentrification. And Karen is around special in being a community activist in the most local and best senses. And um, uh, now, since last Tuesday, I think local activity and local activism is more important than ever. So I'll turn it over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Amy and Robert, and thanks for the invitation. And you've both spoken about my organization, so I can go right past the first slide. And I will, I'm going to go pretty fast because I really am looking forward to the conversation. But I wanted to just say a few things to kind of ground myself and talk about a little bit of the work I've been doing. So I wanted to say that when I always, when I talk, like to bring forward some of the people who've really influenced me. And one of them is John O'Neill, who was with the Free Southern Theater, and then Junebug Productions. And Free Southern Theater was really the theater wing of the civil rights movement. And John taught me many, many things. And this is one of the things that's really been resonating in my mind this week, which he drew from John Lewis and said, "I soon discovered that the struggle we had chosen to engage was not going to be straightened out in 3 to 5 weeks, 3 to 5 months, 3 to 5 years. Indeed, I had joined a struggle that was going to take at least a lifetime. And I made a decision then that this was going to be my life's work." And when I met John, I was really young. I was, probably early 20s, young for me now. And meeting somebody who talked about life's work really shifted my perspective about what I wanted to do. And, was I looking for a job or was I looking for my life's work? And John really sort of rooted me in the ideas of social justice and the idea of really making a commitment to work for a lifetime. John also taught me the story circle process, and maybe some of you have experienced that, but he really developed a particular methodology of it, which I've been using since I've met him. And really it being a way of getting to know people in a very deep way and believing in the power of the story to reveal things that go much deeper than giving a speech or a political speech or it's a way. So the way he built his activism was really with deep respect to people's stories. And just as a little aside, we were asked about a month ago to do a post-election program at the New York International Folk Festival. And when I was asked to do it, we had no idea what the outcome would be. And I was like, I just can't even imagine what to do. And then I said, but the thing we could do is a story circle. And so we had one on Saturday, and it was such a powerful experience and just reminded me in that format where you go around and everybody can tell a story and really actively listen to each other's stories and then give their own story, kind of inspired by the story before theirs. Next slide. So another thing that really influenced me is I worked at Apple Shop for 10 years in Eastern Kentucky. And Apple Shop is a media center. It did a lot of work, or does a lot of work. They've been around for a long time, related to poverty issues, environmental justice, really the culture of Appalachia. And Apple Shop made a film called On Our Own Land. And this woman, Mrs. Wooten, was in the film, and she had stood up for her land and literally kept the companies from stripping it. And so there's a shot in the film where it's from a helicopter above and you see a moonscape of strip mining and you see this one green area and that's her land. And what it says here, and this really happened, they tried to establish her as a pauper in the court. The lawyer asked her if she knew what a pauper meant, and that's almost degrading you. I said, I'll beat you and I don't have to have money. And what I learned from her and so many of the people that I worked with in Appalachia was one thing is a deep respect for land and place. And really having come there from New York, I didn't have that sense of sort of a visceral connection to land. And I learned that from her. And I also learned just to respect people as human beings. So much organizing. It goes back to the stories and her story. And, you know, for them to just say you're ignorant, this happens so often. And again, as an aside, because Robert's on this Zoom, I did have that visceral connection to land a couple nights ago because Prospect Park, which is outside my window, was on fire. And I kind of learned what it meant to feel so deeply connected to a place. Unfortunately, they put the fire out quickly, but it was that sense of what happens with a place that you love, and it disappears. Next slide. So this is some of our work in Brooklyn, and this was related to the rezoning. And as Robert said, the community is really quickly gentrifying, or has, Park Slope has, and this is Gowanus, which is in the process of gentrifying. And there was a rezoning conversation that, you know, if you went to the Arts and Culture Committee, it was pretty much the usual suspects arguing predictable arguments, which were important, but were very much about a very narrow group of people. And left out of those conversations were a lot of the people who lived in the neighborhood, including the people who lived in public housing. And so Imani Gay Gillison, who you can see in this picture, came, and she just kept sitting there like, why aren't you talking about our issues, you know? And literally the rezoning drew a line around public housing because it wasn't included, because it's federal policy rather than city policy. So Imani, you know, at one of the meetings said, you know, I was like, we're here. Issues we face are not just NYCHA and NYCHA's public housing issues. We are your neighbors. And this idea that people who are our neighbors are left out of these participatory conversations was really strong. And we did a project together with Imani and a lot of her neighbors that included creating a play about all the issues going on in public housing, where we invited then the policymakers and the planners. And then we did a series of conversations with her and with El Puente in another neighborhood that was also rezoning, that were conversations with the people left out of the formal conversations. So there were kitchen table conversations, and they were conversations in public housing and in homeless shelters. And then we issued a series of recommendations growing out of those conversations. Next slide. So I just was going to breeze through, and I'll do this really quick, some other forms of connecting on the ground organizing with policymaking. And in this case, it's participatory budgeting, where we have this in New York. It started in Brazil, and it's where the city council and now the city gives a certain amount of their money, both capital and program money, for communities to decide how that money gets allocated. And it's really a wonderful way for community members to really engage in conversations that have a direct and concrete impact. It's a lot of talk, though. It's a lot of meetings. And so we got involved in trying to make it more artful. And one of the things you see here is you have all these community members who develop projects. And then we had community expos where we would connect them with artists, and together they would make these signs so they could meet their neighbors and talk about their projects that were going to be on the ballot for people to vote for. Next slide. So another form of really sort of partnering with a lot of groups around the city was a project that we did called Reimagining New York City. And we sort of did this in response to our participation on the cultural plan for New York City. Because when we did the cultural plan, it was a great experience. But there were so many parameters and ways that, and limitations and negotiations with the city that went into that. And we wanted to do another one that was not burdened with those things and where we could just dream together in neighborhoods. And we had all different kinds of conversations. Unfortunately, it started right when the pandemic did. So a lot of them started out being on Zoom, but then we sat outside and had them. And they were about climate justice and the arts and immigration and the role of cultural hubs in neighborhoods and how they can be part of anti-displacement strategies, and also things like mutual aid and other ways of approaching things than sort of the status quo, public space. And then from those conversations, we gleaned some recommendations, which we've just issued, and that you can see the categories here on the screen that they're in. Next slide. And we published them in a zine that's colorful, and it's a nice way to share them. And I just testified at a hearing, and I gave them all these zines, and it caught their eye. Next slide. So interestingly, there was just a city council hearing about naturally occurring cultural districts, which we were glad that they sort of picked up on that language. And what, I can certainly talk more later about what we mean when we say it, but we're really talking about these organic networks and hubs and communities, and an asset-based approach that says there's culture in every community, and how do we support that instead of trying to export culture into, what people might call cultural deserts, but of course aren't, because there's all kinds of culture there. So we did a project growing out of Reimagining New York that was called Cultivating Neighborhood Networks, because what we learned, especially during the pandemic, but certainly before, is that in difficult times, it's our relationships and our networks that make us strong. And so we worked in 5 different communities, and they were led by local partners, doing work where they were doing it, but then we were simultaneously learning from it about networks and cultivating them. And so, for example, we worked with The Point up in Hunts Point in the Bronx, and they've been doing the fish parade for many years, 20 years. And so they did a series of oral histories around the fish parade and about the networks that were developed over all those years as part of the fish parade. And you can see again on the slide, this was part of my testimony for the city council about what we sort of saw as the ingredients, learning from these 5 communities for really strong neighborhood networks. And so some of these you can read here are community self-determination, strong cultural hubs, sustained cross-sector partnerships, leadership development, access to affordable space, peer learning, progressive policies that further equity, and long-term flexible funding that's responsive to the unique context of the communities. Next slide. So I think because Robert knows her, and because I always love to evoke her, Claudine Brown is a colleague, a treasured colleague, who also has passed away, but informed most of my thinking. And Claudine was part of our group that started Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts New York, and it was at the during the financial crisis, when everybody was kind of struggling to say, how are we going to survive? What's going to happen to us? And we brought a group of people together and said, instead of sort of circling the wagons in each of our sectors to say, how are we going to survive? Let's reframe the question and say, how do we come together in a community and survive as communities by working across sectors, and what's an affirmative framework for that? And we came up with this idea of naturally occurring cultural districts as our framework. And Claudine said at that time, this is a time when the country needs a new spirit. Artists can help us to imagine that new and different world. As the recovery process proceeds, artists are needed to teach our children to dream and to create solutions for a sustainable world. And she was saying that coming out of the economic crisis, but it certainly resonated during the pandemic, and it resonates for me this week. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. So one of the things I neglected to say about the story circle that we did on Saturday is we struggled a little bit to come up with our prompt for the story circle because it was supposed to be election stories, but we weren't sure that that was the appropriate prompt. So instead we came up with a prompt, which was tell a story about a time when, by drawing on your connections with other people, it gave you strength in a difficult time. And so that was our prompt last Saturday. And I think this idea of our connections and our relationships, and that's why I'm so interested in neighborhood networks, is a really powerful notion. And so every year and a half or so, we have our cultural organizing for community change workshop, which I know Robert's been to. And we have one coming up on December 15th at the Mercury store. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to come together and sing together, dance together, learn about environmental justice together. We're going to have story circles there. We're going to talk about the future and imagination. So I invite you all to join us, and I'll put the link for it in the chat. And I think I'm going to end there.
Well, thank you, Caron. You certainly have a lot to say. And last night I was reading the publication you did. It's a free online download, Bridging Conversations, and which is full of stories. And I think one of the couple of themes in the book were about bridging differences between people who have different perspectives. They're coming from different places. Each of them has a different consciousness of the situation that was very vividly illustrated. And another is about the in-between space, the interstices, where you find that space between for people to come together. I wonder if you could speak to that a bit about when you're in a situation where the people you work with have big differences and where they might have ideological differences from you or the people in your organization, and how you're able to find the common ground. Maybe you have an illustration of that.
Yeah, and I will say one thing about those bridge conversations, because the first person I did one with was Ken Wilson, an anthropologist, and I remember asking him about bridging from two different places, and he said, "You're asking the wrong question. It really isn't about connecting two different things. It's about that space. It is that third space in between." He said, "It's the bridge. The bridge is, in ecology, it's the edge spaces where all of the diversity is, and it's where all of the interesting things happen in that kind of space." So I think one example I can give you is we do a lot of work in Kensington, Brooklyn. It's a community that has a lot of immigrants in it, and also it's a gentrifying community with newcomers who don't really know or interact much with the immigrant communities. And I remember there was a point in after the election in 2016 when people, a lot of people in the immigrant communities, and there's a lot of Muslims who live there, were very concerned about what was going to happen to them. And there were a lot of the other folks that were concerned about them, but really had no way of reaching out or connecting with them. And so we actually did a Meet Your Neighbors dinner. And it seemed really simple, but I was working with my colleague Hasiba Haq, who had just graduated college, and we were actually trying to figure out what we should be doing in the neighborhood. And this kind of became a self-evident thing. And she, through her family network, who are Muslim Bangladeshi, reached out, and we were able to tap into a number of networks and really bring people together who would never be in a room together. And we didn't really do anything except break bread. You know, there were a lot of people who wanted to put a political agenda onto it. And we felt like the political agenda was getting everybody in the room and saying, we're all part of a neighborhood and we need to have each other's backs. And we did have a kind of know your rights information there, but that was a really important catalytic moment. And now every year we have a community iftar there, which is, as somebody described it, a rabbi friend as is one of the few iftars she goes to and really feels like she belongs. It's a iftar that is led by young Muslim women, but is a feel to it like it's welcome to everybody to come to. And we do it outside in a public space. So that's an example of a bridging.
And I hear in that also that it's an effort to make what you start self-sustaining. And just my second question, and then we can turn it over to, I'm sure other people have questions here about how you, as a student of and the Cultural Sustainability Program, who's unfortunately not here today, asked, how do you future-proof these activities? How do you create a structure so they're self-sustaining? So if you happen to leave, that they'll continue.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just stick with the same example. Kensington is an interesting place for me because I have to be behind. I'm not in front of anything. And it doesn't matter if I leave because our main focus is immigrant communities and Muslim communities, and I'm not a member of either of those. I'm an ally. So it's pretty essential that I am supporting the work of other people. And because our focus was youth and Muslim women when we started out, Hasiba, you know, was born and raised in the community and reflects the groups that we primarily want to work with. And so the first thing Hasiba did, you know, and she started right out of college, is that she brought in some other young women to mentor because she didn't feel like she was going to necessarily, you know, stay there forever. And so there's been a really strong emphasis in the program to bringing in young people and figuring out how they can take leadership roles. And a lot of what I've been doing is raising money to support them.
Mm-hmm. So it's mentorship and also, I guess, for want of a better word, institutionalizing, setting up activities and events that become institutionalized. And what I love about the iftar idea is it's a traditional genre of event. I mean, obviously that happens at Ramadan, and infusing it with this dimension of bringing people together, which is a tough challenge in a place like New York, where there's, I think, like so many other parts of the country, there's been an erosion of opportunities for people to come together. So, you know, I know that's been quite a successful activity.
And, you know, I have to say that with the word sustainability, for me, I think, you know, I worked for 10 years at Apple Shop in Kentucky, and I see somebody is on here who lives in Johnson City, which I'm excited about because I spent a lot of time in Johnson City. And I was very much part of institution building with Apple Shop. It's been around for decades. In the work I do, it's less about institution building and more about network building, where change is good. You know, I don't want to build something that's going to stay the same. I want to build something that's going to shift given the moment and the need of the time. And so, you know, not reactive, but really being able, like you said, to what did you say,
Future proofing of student Jenny Squires.
But to me, it's more like, how can we be so flexible and looking ahead so that we don't get stuck by having to survive in our old form, which is what a lot of nonprofits end up having to try to do. And instead think about ways that we can morph and change, but do it driven by social justice values.
So I'd like to open this up for questions and comments and thoughts. I see the I see the bubbles coming out of people's head. You can raise a hand or just speak. Kieran, I know you're never at a loss for words. You
That's
always
right.
say, please.
Well, I don't think inside my head, I think as I speak. So, but sometimes that gets me into trouble. So, um, so Karen, greetings from Appalachia, from Johnson City. Thanks so much for sharing. The it's kind of a question or an issue I grapple with. It was something that Robert said though, not, and I appreciate everything you said, but it was when you said something about local really matters. And it matters now very much. And I agree with that. But I struggle a little bit with focusing on the local when I also know that there's some really big issues that are global. And I want to challenge and tackle those as well. I don't want to ignore that. And it's that kind of thing between the macro and the micro that's always sort of like tearing me, it's a tension within inside of me. And I wonder how you might approach that. Or if
Oh, is this for me or Robert? Because
for yourself, Karen, yeah.
Oh, great. I totally agree with you. And what was it? There was a guy I used to work with, Tomasi Barrow Frausto, and he called it the glocal. And it's the intersection between the global and the local. And I think that's where the really powerful stories are, right? Because you don't want to just be so global that you're not it's not rooted in actual people's experience, but you don't want to be so local that you can't accomplish what you're saying. So one of the things that I've been really interested in, and in New York City in our work, it's connecting the dots between the local neighborhoods in our citywide alliance so we can have more impact around change. And I would say the same thing around connecting local areas nationally and internationally. And something I really admired at Appleshop was its ability to have conversations in Indonesia and in South America and in the South Bronx, because there were common denominators in all of their experiences, around environmental justice. And you could thread between all of these local experiences to make a much bigger analysis and impact. So I would argue that grounding the global in the local makes the global even more effective.
And vice versa, and replication and modeling when you do work in a local way with that can be replicated, reproduced, in other communities on terms. And I didn't mean to suggest that the local work precludes the global, of course, and I think that there are these intersections. But I guess what I was suggesting is the frustration of the moment. That the kind of deep meaning that we can find in local activities. Brandon, it's great to see you. It's been a while, and you'd like to say something.
Yeah, hello everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I am out in the wilderness with spotty internet. But thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you, Karen, for everything that you've shared. I think my question revolves around so much of my professional work has been looking at culturally informed community development work in an urban setting, in an urban environment where there's the luxury of density and now I am venturing out, and the work that I'm doing now out here is on 100-acre forest land collective, where the bridging of community and community voices takes place over tens and 20s of miles, right? Community looks different in an urban setting. Stories and things look different. Environmental conversations look different when you're talking about a span of hundreds of acres. And so I'm just like curious about, in your experience, the shift in strategy and approach from an urban environment to one in which may be sprawling in a rural environment.
Yeah, and honestly, the last time I worked in a rural environment was a good long time ago. I feel like it was yesterday, but it wasn't. So I think some of the examples I would give were are not the examples from now. But when I was at Apple Shop, one of the most effective things we had was a community radio station. And because it broadcast and it connected people in ways over the airwaves, and in a way that I don't know that the internet is doing. You know, there's something about the community radio station where everybody came in and volunteered and ran, did their own shows. That was a very effective thing. But another example that's more recent is, I don't know if you know Carlton Turner's work. He, you know him, in SIP culture. I'm really very inspired by what he's doing. And for those of you who don't know, he's working in Mississippi and are doing work around food justice and culturally based. I didn't even ask you where you are. Where are you calling from? Or
I am just about 2.5 hours north of San Francisco
okay,
in Casadero, Sonoma County.
yeah, okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, so and so Carlton is in Mississippi and has been doing really amazing work around. He had been working nationally as the director of alternate routes. Really felt compelled to go back to his home community and felt like he could have more impact doing there, and really went deep into the community that he's from in Mississippi.
Mm.
But I'm going to put this
Yeah.
question back on you. What are you learning as you're doing the work about how to adjust to the spread out nature of the rural community?
So it's been uh, a master class. I served on the board of this organization, and now I think I'm stepping in as the ED. So it's just like a whole shift for me. But I think one of the challenges that I'm finding is being able to clearly define community here. And the challenge is when on our property, it's 900 acres. And so there are pockets of small communities and pockets of people, but there's not a one system that interconnects all of us. Um, and the work that we're doing here is land conservation work, forest conservation work. And so we're working closely with the Kashaya to return the ways in which we're operating on the land from an ecological standpoint to its kind of native indigenous practices. And so we're really trying to make sure that all of the things that we're doing here on this land, and we're thinking about doing over this 100 acres, feels supported and understood by all of our, like, just the scaling of community, scaling of stakeholders is significantly vaster than anything I've had to navigate before. Um, and I'm trying to figure it out in real time right now. And so I'm like, as much resources as people can offer me. But what I'm finding is what just like identifying commonalities, living in a rural environment in itself requires a certain type of lifestyle, a certain type of resourcefulness, a certain type of self-sufficiency. And I think the more we can kind of like anchor those that shared way of living with all of our neighbors has been really helpful. Also like thinking about resource sharing and bartering for one of the things, like we're getting some road work done and we were able to connect with a neighbor that we hadn't been able to in years because we're able to share this road work. And so I think I've been struggling with the ways in which to like build community, have focused conversations around the ecological impacts of all the work that we're doing here. One of the big helpers we've been working really closely with the Kashaya and their network. And so in many ways, I am learning deeply from the Kashaya leaders on how to best kind of steward relationships with not only the other communities that are here, but just with the land itself. And so I don't have all of the answers. I have been thrown into this situation, and I am trying to figure it out. That's why I'm so happy that I joined this call. But it's been really interesting, all of the ways that I think I developed a toolkit for urban environments and thinking about urban community development, thinking about placemaking, placekeeping in an urban standpoint, when there are clear zoning and political structures to interact with or navigate. It doesn't happen here. In rural environments. So the frameworks in which I've been approaching all of my work in some ways don't serve me in as the easy ways anymore. Um, yeah, and so I'll stop rambling, but I'm still figuring it out, and it's a beautiful and exciting challenge for me to explore here. But thinking the ways of how to kind of serve as create those bridges and connect communities and people across scale. Especially, and one last thing that I'll say, and I promise I'll shut up. Another challenge in this too that's different than in urban environments is it's easy in urban environments to think a couple of generations out, like this structure, this neighborhood, maybe this building could last, 20 to 50 years, or you think about zoning policies. But here we're really thinking about impacts that may have hundreds of years of impact here. Right? We're thinking of deep generation work here. So it's like needing to not only just be in relation with you, but needing to be in relation, hopefully, with your grandkids. And how do we lay the foundation for that deep generational level work is just daunting and also deeply inspiring.
Rory, you have something to
Yeah,
say.
yeah. I just want to kind of riff off what you were saying, Brandon. What sounds like really cool work, dude. One thing that strikes me is to think about calendrically based gatherings as a way of creating opportunities for people to have those kind of uh, evanescent moments of interaction, that would be, delightful as well as, sort of functional. But one thing that I gathered from what you said also is, in doing this kind of work, some of the tools that maybe we can, avail ourselves of are the things that are, one learns. That there are these ways that people, transmit knowledge and so forth. And that kind of brings me to my question for Caron Atlas. As you, kind of reflect back on the work that you've done, and then, I'm kind of in the same position. Like, I feel like part of our work is to pass things on and to help, empower people who are going to be facing, these probably challenging decades. What are the tools that enable this work to be done well? What are the kinds of perspectives and knowledges and skills that you think are kind of the essential ingredients to be able to effectively work with communities, empowering communities ethically and so forth. Yeah, I mean, just, it's like, if you could go to, I don't know if you went to grad school, I bet you probably did. Like, what is it that you really wish you had learned there instead of, to do the real work that you've been doing these past few years?
Oh, what an interesting question. I mean, so before I get into sort of technical things, one thing is, and in thinking of of Brandon's comments, I think, being humble and not feeling like I'm the person coming in to give the answers is really important. And and I really appreciate your saying rural isn't the same as urban, because when I worked at Apple Shop, I can't tell you how many urban people came and told us what to do and kind of rolled their eyes because we weren't doing it their way. And I'm an urban person and I just knew it wasn't right. Although I think there are more commonalities in some funny ways with neighborhoods and rural areas. But, you know, when we started naturally occurring cultural districts for a year, we invited each other to each other's neighborhoods and sat down with people there and just got to know each other and got to know the place before we put our agenda together for our work as a network. And if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't still be together. We found our common values. We learned about each other's places. We came with curiosity. And then after that, we were ready to go. I think that some of the things I wished I learned, facilitation, like creative facilitation. And, you know, I just was part of a gathering with someone named Gibran Rivera, who is just a master facilitator. And I appreciated him so much. And I did take some, you know, trainings with him, but, you know, more of that. I think understanding more about conflict resolution, but not conflict resolution, but like the real deep ways to deal with situations when you don't agree and you don't have to agree. I think I wish I had learned more about that. I wish I had learned more about creative and transformational approaches to things. I feel like so much of what I learned was again more like technical knowledge than adaptive knowledge. You know, like I learned how to do stuff rather than be in a moment when I didn't know the answer and work with others collaboratively to find the answer together. I feel like that's a skill. So those are a few things off the top of my head. I wish I had not denied my own creativity, as I think a lot of us do. I saw myself more as an organizer, even though I'm a cultural organizer. And it was sort of like, oh, well, they're the artists. I'm not an artist. I'll, you know, organize. And I wish I hadn't been trained that I had to kind of deny my creativity to be an effective organizer. And I'm spending a lot of time trying to unlearn.
Yeah, that's another thing. It's like, what do you have to unlearn?
Yeah, another gem I drew out of Bridging Conversations was about Brad Landers, the comptroller of New York City, and now, and was our local councilman. He said, you know, I never thought of myself as an artist, but you know, and sort of bringing people together and making things happen. There's an artistry there, there's a creativity there, you know. So you know, the creativity that all people have, even though it might not be a highly aestheticized, you know, expression. I mean, it's something to value and also something that is you know, is the lubricant for conversations and for storytelling and for people coming together for a common purpose.
Yeah, and I think Brad, you know, would say, you know, you have to have imagination if you really believe, you know, transformative change is going to happen, you know, and you know, and it's not just artists who need imagination. We all do.
So I guess we have time for one or two more questions. I know you have some thoughts there.
And let me just add one other thing
Yeah.
with the I wish I learned in school. I went to school a long time ago, and I definitely wish that I learned more about issues of racism and just all of the conversations we're having now, we didn't have when I was in school. And, you know, just being able to understand my position in this work.
Well, Rory, you and I were all spent our time in Hyde Park, and it was right in front of us. And you know, I think there were some things that we avoided, but it was all around us.
Yeah.
More thoughts? Anybody?
Don't be afraid. And if people could turn their cameras on, that'd be so sweet, so that we can, you know, sort of imagine ourselves as a group of human beings together. Of course.
And it doesn't have to be a question. It could be, I mean, I really appreciate Brandon just talking about something he's, you know, a challenge he's dealing with.
I was just gonna comment on this notion of using the arts and how it doesn't need to be at a super high level. I think your example that you showed of the participatory budgeting, poster boards that people came together to augment and show creatively why they felt that issue was better to vote for than the other, was a lovely example of how the arts can bring, and creativity can bring people together to focus on these changes that we're looking to do.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I'm coming from a folklore background, and we study expressive culture. But I think if we also acknowledge and really lean into the way expressive culture is is the mode in which we develop relationships, and that there's a kind of, I think, a critical aspect of the nature of those relationships as the starting point for this work, as you mentioned, Caron, in terms of avoiding that kind of top-down, heavy-handed kind of planning, administrative, seeing people as objects approach. That's something I've always celebrated in your work, is saying, let's not just look at the things that are obviously visible. Let's look at the ways that people are creatively making lives in different places. And, we need to be able to not set that part of ourselves aside in terms of working and, in a genuine way, an I-thou relationship.
Mm. Yeah,
yeah.
by
And
that.
what I would say with those workshops is, it's not about the product so much as that it was the process, the workshops where they made those boards and they brought their families with them. And it was like this whole process of creating together. And then the expo where they got to talk with their neighbors about their projects, because PB is supposed to be all about the community folks, but a lot of times the media makes it about the city council members who gave the money. And so this was a way to really shine the light on the community members who developed the projects.
Absolutely. It's so funny. I was just texting that before you said those exact words, I was typing those words and I think they only went to Amy. But absolutely, the process of art making, I think, is absolutely more valuable than the product, especially when you're thinking about the impacts it has of just being a lubricant for dialogue, or being a mode for articulating the things that are just hard to articulate. So, yep.
Mm.
I want to just come back to this, what you said earlier about institutions and networks, and I think, there is some value in terms of institutions in a land that where institutions are the kind of, the citadels upon which livelihoods exist and so forth. But the networks, this is really maybe where the global and the local, or the local and the more than local, can kind of articulate. And the network of networks, the kind of fractal of, like, the people that went to that workshop being empowered, and then you being connected with colleagues and other partners. I think those things are very important, and things that we could benefit from leaning into, and you seeing as modes of sustaining ourselves and each other.
Yeah, and I feel like they're so connected too, because when we were doing our participatory research, like one of our partners was El Puente in South in a Puerto Rican neighborhood, and they, a lot of my work has been about standing up for institutions, and especially institutions of color, and to say this is an anti-displacement strategy to really support these cultural hubs and these neighborhoods that play such important roles. And at the same time, so El Puente does that, and they were critical during the pandemic as a place where people came and kind of holding their community together. But they also work in Puerto Rico, and they're also really networked around all over the world around the issues they work on. And I do think they're a great example of both sort of the strong cultural hub in a neighborhood and branching out into all these international networks.
Actually have I don't know if this is an answerable question, but I would love your thoughts. It feels like we're obviously in a time when this kind of organizing is more important than ever, and that we need to be organizing across differences, right? Across sectors and across differences. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice or guidance on, just how to even get started in one's own community.
I mean, it depends on what the difference is, right? I think the commonality where I've seen it work the best is people make a commitment over a very long time to each other, and they're willing to be in uncomfortable conversations and hang in there. That's one thing. The other is when people come together because they have a common immediate goal. And that often, this is when you have these extraordinary moments during crisis, right? You have during Hurricane Sandy, we did all this work. We created this kind of almost utopian shelter space where everybody came together, and all these artists from all over the city connected with people for months in an armory, in a totally what you would think of as an inhumane setting, but it was all these people worked together to create a humane setting. And a lot of the people were from the Rockaways. I would say if we all put our political beliefs out, we would not have agreed with many of the people there. No. But we had a different goal in that moment, and it was that these folks had been displaced from their homes, and they were elderly, and they were in a horrible situation, and we were all going to work together to make it bearable. And and then politics started getting into it, because then when they left the shelter and when we're going back to their homes, there were all kinds of political situations preventing them from going home. So it did tie into organizing. But there was a common goal that we were all working for. And I think that, the case that also happened at Apple Shop recently in Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, when there was a horrible flood there and the community was devastated. And a lot of the Apple Shop folks just stopped doing what they were doing and reached out to the community, even though they lost their building. Just to say, we're all part of this community. How do we come together and survive this? Then the question is how you go from there to the next step, when the crisis is over.
Kieran.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay to not ask this if other people want to ask a question, but I have a question. But if
go ahead.
Okay. So let me be upfront. So thing I'm struggling with right now is how to not be angry, and there's a lot of conversations about we need to unify when I'm not ready to unify. There's I'm wondering about the place of what might be righteous anger. You work in Appalachia, there's a lot of righteous anger when so many people have been exploited. And my wife is from Lee County, Virginia, right? So you know that area very well. And there's also when a lot of things say we have to forgive, and I'm not ready to forgive. I don't think many people are ready to forgive. I'm talking about recently, I'm talking about many years of when it's suddenly expected to just sort of, and I do a lot of this work when I have to sort of reach across and find common ground, but it's also very personally difficult as well. So I guess it's just something I'm sort of struggling a little bit with them at the moment with uh, how to best channel some of that into something that's positive.
Yeah, I wish I had
Yeah,
the answer to
I,
that question.
I'm
But
just laying it out there. But
what I would say is we all don't have to do everything. And I think, I was just on a call and they were using, I can't refer to what the essay is, one of the essays that was going around where people were talking about the different pathways you can follow. And there's the pathway of resistance, there's the pathway of building alternatives, there's the pathway of trying to work on behalf of people so they don't get harmed. It's, there's all these different pathways. And I would just say you have to walk. I think everybody's work doesn't have to follow the same pathway. And, I think of this like sometimes when I would I teach and the students are all direct action or nothing. And I'm not a direct action. I mean, I'll go out in the streets, but that's not my strategy most of the time. So it's like, great, I'm glad there's direct action. I hope there's more of that. It may not be the pathway I take. But the thing I do know is that I don't think I've ever done organizing where people were dehumanized. I don't feel like, I feel like it's hard, but I also don't think it's effective if we're just working with an undefined group of people or a group of people we're angry at or a group of people, So I do feel like there's got to be some work if we want to, if that's our pathway to humanize each other. And I do think stories is a way to go.
Thank you.
I didn't answer your question. I think we're all kind of in that place of figuring out our next steps over time and sort of where the best place for us are.
I appreciate it.
Well, after the 2016 election, Barack Obama said, things zig and they zag.
Things are?
Zig and they zag.
Oh,
Meaning, it turns and then it turns in other directions, and it was a certain degree of solace. Yeah.
oh, but I'm sort of talking about not just what happened last week. I'm talking about this past year. I'm talking about people that are supposed to be like-minded that have somehow neglected people that are brown. We're not valued. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm talking about Palestine.
Yeah.
I'm talking about that. And it's my own party. I'm supposed to. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger in this. So, and I'm suddenly you're suddenly expected to be a peace builder and bring everyone together, and it's very hard to do that. You know what I mean?
Well, and maybe you're not doing it with your party. I mean, maybe that's not the target that you want to be working with. I mean, I will say another thing that I learned from John O'Neill, and I don't know, it was the first time I met him. We were at a gathering, and somebody was performing a play they had created about a racist who was their teacher, and they were doing the play of this. It was a Little Black Sambo play where the teacher was being incredibly racist, and the person was doing this piece to kind of purge themselves of this horrible teacher. And they did it, and the whole convening erupted from her doing this because she did like a straight up depiction of the teacher. And there were so many conversations, and the whole thing got divided around race, and it was a very difficult moment. And I remember John O'Neill saying, you can't, and he said, why did you make this play? And she said, because I hated this teacher and I needed to say that. And he said, you can't build work out of hate.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to work. It's going to do what came out of this piece. And that really stuck with me. There's all kinds of things we can do out of our passion for justice, but out of hatred, I think that's really difficult.
I agree.
Any other comments? I know there's so much food for thought here, and we're in a conversation, we're telling stories, and I think that it speaks to what we're speaking about here. It's illuminating, and there are no easy solutions, but trying to get our perspectives and do mutual support and speak to each other, and recognize that we have anger and rage as well. So
And we can stop the recording if people want to keep talking. So I'll just say, Caron, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Robert, for facilitating the discussion. And thank you, everybody, for coming.